Okay.
So we're going to continue on our discussion of last week, which was this halachic concept, the novelty. Have a cup of water, please?
No, sure.
A novel halachic concept of what's called Ed Echad Ne'eman Be'isurim. A single witness is loyal, trustworthy when it comes to items that are potentially forbidden. So just so you know, there is not a very clear consensus on where we learn this halakha from. We mentioned last week that there are situations in which the Torah believes one witness. The Sotah was one of them. And there, even the Gemara discusses how the Sotah at least has raglayim ladabar. The Gemara says maybe this is literally means the thing has feet, meaning it's got a foundation to stand on. Raglayim, like the table, has supports. So they're called the legs of the table. So in the case of the Sotah, where there were two witnesses and he warned her not to go with this guy in seclusion, and she did, then the Torah believes one witness because there's been this, there's a bit more of a history, a bit more of a basis to the concept. How do we know that one individual can be trusted when it comes to items of Kashrut, for example? Fascinating discussion. Rashi mentions this in a few different places in the Talmud. Number one, really when it comes to Gitin, is the locus of the discussion, meaning the location in which it's most deeply evaluated. What happens when it comes to Gitin? How does one give his wife a get if they no longer live in the same area? Right? Just got a call today, I spoke to her. We spoke last week too. She used to live in Philadelphia, and now she's in New Jersey. The ex-husband is still somewhere in Pennsylvania. Okay, so what do you do? What happens if they live in different countries? So the Gemara says, not a problem. What does the Torah require us to do? The husband has to write a get, or he has to command someone to write a get for him. And then if his wife isn't there to receive the get, what does he do?
He sends it, or the Beit Din keeps it. It's one of the two, I think.
Well, the Beit Din, you're flying 3 people out to give it to her. Really, he can give it to a shaliach. What's a shaliach in Hebrew?
One guy?
An agent.
Messenger.
Or a messenger. An emissary. So a man can have a get written and give it to his wife. How do we know it was him? How do we know he wrote it to this particular wife? Maybe he's a politician, he's got like 5. Well, do you have a choice? So how many shlichim do I need to send? 5? Make it a big deal, we'll send 3, like Yohan was going to suggest.
No, I was saying you keep
and
it.
I expense this, so who gets the American Express points? You know? Wait a second. I have to get a get from one place to the other. The more expensive you make this get, the less gitin are going to be written. Because, as Margaret Thatcher used to say, like it or not, the facts of life are conservative. If it's more expensive, people will buy less. So, a guy wants to send a get to his wife, says the Gemara, he can send it with one shaliach. And what's the shaliach has to say? I've done this about 200 times. Shaliach has to, normally when there's a Beit Din, the sofer is the guy that makes the shaliach to. So I wrote it, and I fold it up, and then I have to give it to her. Sometimes you have to wait for him or for the police to leave, and then you can... So, it gets colorful. So what does the shaliach have to say? B'fanai nechtav, u'fanai nachtam. B'fanai nechtav, this get was written in my presence, u'fanai nachtam, and it was signed in my presence. So the husband, or a witness, an agent appointed by him, wrote this get. 2 people signed the get. 2 witnesses signed the get at the husband's command. Now it's an official get. Now I have to deliver it to her. But I'm only one person. So here the Gemara says, so no, are we going to believe him or are we not going to believe him? Well, says the Gemara, we have no choice. Where else do we find examples of something crucial, something critical, depending on one witness that we believe?
If a husband dies, shall we shut him?
Yes. Yes, we will accept testimony from one person if the husband died.
Except if I know there are a few exceptions, like the mother-in-law, the sister-in-law, and all.
Right. We've been through this yet. We will take testimony from one witness that the husband died, except that we're probably going to qualify that with the witness in question testifying in such a way that he or she, even we would accept a woman too, would know that this depended on that. So if I was on, for example, if I was on a boat that sank, and I'm the only survivor, I can tell the Beit Din which men were on that boat and who died, and therefore their wives are allowed to remarry. But what if what if we require 2 witnesses? Well, if I'm the only witness that was there, the other witnesses died, sorry, I mean, none of these women can remarry. Literally, that's aguna. They're anchored. They're stuck because we don't know if the husbands are alive or dead, and we can't trust this guy.
So if no one came back, you have no way to allow the women to.
Then it gets much more complicated. The example in the Gemara is a burning building. Nobody survived burning buildings.
So Shalom it actually happened.
9/11 was a classic
It's in our
example.
community. Yeah.
9/11 was a classic example. So what happens? If we know for a fact someone was inside an inferno, right? I mean, a fire that no one survived. We have no evidence that anyone did or could have survived. A plane crash. This flight. It's not in the news anymore because we have other things to talk about.
Yeah, the flight from
the Malaysian.
From
Malaysia. So everyone on the plane. Well, we have to assume they died because nobody contacted us. They haven't found it. They stopped looking. So, if God forbid there was a married Jewish man on the plane, his wife would at some point have to go through this process to be permitted to remarry. Now, Rashi gets a little bit more creative. Can you think of any other situations in which there is an object or a process of grave halachic importance that is only performed by one individual, and whose word we have to take when it comes to determining that it's kosher or not kosher?
Well, I know you're talking about shechita.
Well, okay, shechita is in fact the classic example, but I'm not even talking about shechita.
Oh, you're talking about cooking then?
No, I'm not even talking about slaughtering an animal for your own kitchen. Where else are animals slaughtered that we have to assume the guy who did the work did it right if he tells us he did? Beit HaMikdash. How do I know the Kohen Gadol actually brought the Ketoret into Kodesh HaKodeshim? Well, I didn't see it. Did you? No. Did you? Let's start a conspiracy theory. What? How do I know that the Korban that I gave the Kohen was properly slaughtered? How do I know that the knife was checked? How do I know that the simanim, you cut the trachea and the esophagus? How do I know that the lungs were kosher? How do I know that it was properly put on the Mizbeach? Everything that happens in Beit HaMikdash has to be trusted. I mean, the individual has to be entrusted with the work. Otherwise, every korban becomes 3 times more expensive. We'd have to pay professional witnesses to stand there and say, he did it right, he did it wrong, that's good, that's bad, etc. So the Kohen Gadol, can we trust him? I hope so. Have we had corrupt politicians for Kohanim Gadolim? Absolutely. Absolutely. Did we still have to trust them anyway? Yes. Did they die nonetheless? They did. We appointed someone else who was just as corrupt, but they didn't last more than a year. So, if nothing else, there's a term to our suffering. So, this is the case when it comes to Shechita and Beit HaMikdash. This is the case when it comes to the Kohen Gadol. And, says Rashi, if you really want to scratch and dig on this topic, how can anyone eat by anyone else? How is it, which is, by the way, a very funny argument to make. I'm going to have to respond to that in just a minute. I know that it bothers Sophia and she's being polite by not saying it, but I'll reply to her question in a second. How can it be that we eat in each other's houses? Do I know, in fact, was I accompanying Mike Hasson when he went to his Libyan supermarket and bought sisa and makrut and all these foods that should be forbidden because they're undigestible? How do I know that the ingredients, toxic though they may be, were in fact procured from a kosher supermarket, or with they were prepared by someone who knows what he or she is doing? The vegetables were checked for insects, etc. The answer is I know because Mike's a nice guy. Not just a nice guy, but he's a halakhically competent guy and he cares, and therefore I can trust him and I can be there. So it could be the Kohen Gadol who slaughtered the lamb that we're going to eat at his house, but I wasn't there, and Mike wasn't there. So Mike's trusting the guy who did the shechita, and I'm trusting him, etc. Rashi says, if you don't believe in this concept that the Gemara almost has trouble proving that Ed Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim, Rashi says, we rely on this concept when it comes to shechita. How do you know the meat is kosher? Because the guy who slaughtered it told me it was. Incidentally, just so you know, there happens to be a discussion as to what happens if there's a mashgiach in the slaughterhouse. The mashgiach said the shechita was kosher and the shechit says it wasn't. Who do we trust?
Well, I would say we trust the shechet.
Yeah.
But the shochet, we have 2 options. Either we trust the shochet or we trust the more restricted one. In doubt, I guess.
There are halakhot of shechita that the mashgiach can't check. For example, how hard the shochet was pressing. He can check the knife. The knife could have been dulled in the process. If the shochet says, I pressed too hard, or instead of slicing, I pushed, and the mashgiach can't tell or didn't see, we would trust the shochet.
No, but it makes sense. The shochet knows he did something wrong.
This is an excellent question.
I don't understand.
This is an excellent
That's
question.
why you
The
said
question-
I don't know if I'm going to get to
there's
it.
someone checking,
I don't know if I'm going to get to it tonight. Maybe get to it next
The
week.
most difficult question is the other way around. The shochet says it's fine, but the mashgiach says it's not.
It's a depending on the settings or the circumstances, we can actually convene a beit din and investigate. You say it's kosher, why? You say it's not kosher, why? The Gemara talks about this. The Gemara talks about situations in which they had disputes or discussions about whether or not it's acceptable.
But do you need a mashgiach in that? You don't need a mashgiach in this one.
No, in fact, this is the proof. The Gemara says, can someone do shechita and give the meat to someone, or even sell the meat to someone else? And the Gemara says, yes. Why? Because one witness is reliable, is trustworthy when it comes to items that relate to what's forbidden and what's permitted. And Rashi says, because if you don't believe this, you trust it for shechita, you trust it for nikur, you trust it for the gidon hashed, the sciatic nerve, you trust it for the cherev, and if you don't hold from this concept, no Jew can eat in any other Jew's house. Period. That's the proof. How do I know that we rely on the halachic concept of one witness is enough, even if it's the person who did the shechita himself? Because without this, it's impossible to eat in people's houses. Sophia, back to your question, because to be honest with you, it bothers me too. Do you mean to tell me that there's such a high, lofty Torah ideal of eating in each other's houses that in a situation where we otherwise might have thought we need two witnesses, we're only going to need one, because at the end of the day, if we need two witnesses and we don't have them, then I can eat by Sophia's house for lunch? The answer is, funny as it sounds, yes. In fact, because this is the way society is and functions, and because halachically responsible Jews have relied on this for thousands of years, the answer is yes. It's such a fundamental precept of the Jewish religion that we should be able to trust each other and eat in each other's houses, then one witness is enough. So it's enough that I ask you, is the food kosher? You tell me yes. We'll talk a little bit more in detail about what you need to know about kashrut in order to make that determination, and whether or not mashgichim are actually progress or regression. Okay? Let me tell you a funny and scary story. I was discussing with a man of significant halachic competence and responsibility. In fact, runs a Kashrut organization. And he told me that he spoke once to a butcher who received a 4/4 of beef. Okay, the 4/4 is split between the 12th and the 13th ribs. So ribs 12 and down, with the shoulder, the breast, the brisket, the neck, etc. And everything from 13 and back is the hindquarters. So he receives a 4/4 of beef, and there's a chunk of lung stuck to the inside of the ribs, right? You may or may not be familiar with these discussions about what happens when we check the lungs, what it is that we're checking for. Okay, so do you remember? We did inflate a pair of lungs. Still have pictures. You didn't blow up the lungs yourself?
I
You didn't. Not this time. Next time. God's help. This coming Sunday, by the way. I hope you're coming. Your husband told you that you're not coming.
So he wants to go.
Right. Well, I think it'd be great. You'd learn a lot.
Yeah, I'm
So,
Do you ever take women?
huh?
Do you ever take women?
Sure. I've had women blow up the lungs too. They don't make them like they used to. So, the discussion. In fact, Tunisian women typically. Anyway, so the guy receives a 4/4 of beef that has lungs stuck to it. Now, what you're looking for when you check the lungs is to make sure that the lungs are smooth. There are certain kinds of adhesions. These are like strings of scar tissue that attach the lungs to the ribs. You check them. We mentioned in, we went over this maybe a year and a half ago, year and a half ago, that there are certain situations in which we accept the adhesions. According to Sephardim, we don't even check. We don't blow up the lungs, ever. And according to Ashkenazim, you would. And if it's an adhesion of the acceptable kind, it's kosher. If it's not, then it's not. And sometimes the lungs are absolutely, totally, entirely, and completely stuck to the ribs, which makes breathing very difficult in the animal, because every time the lungs move in either direction, either they're expanding or contracting, there's a tug of war going on between your lungs and the tissues they're attached to. If you received a 4/4 of beef that has a piece of lung stuck to it, first of all, the USDA wasn't supposed to let it out of the slaughterhouse like that, because they usually remove the lung. They insist on removing lungs in their entirety. Second of all, there's no chance. There is absolutely no chance this animal was kosher. But it came to him with what's probably considered the strictest Hashgacha in North America. Not one of, but the. Okay? I'll reserve their names for another time, but this is the nature of the industry. And in If you'd like to discuss further, feel free to inquire. So this rabbi calls up the Dayan, who is in charge of this Kashrut organization, and says, so-and-so, gentleman that I know, who buys meat from your shechita that you supervise, received a 4/4 of beef with lungs stuck to it. Was this not even checked? So he said, no, it's been checked. It's 100%. I guarantee you, our process is perfect. System is perfect. The mashgichim are perfect. I said, well, how could it be that a piece of lung was so stuck that when they removed the lungs, it ripped off and left a chunk over? There's no way that would have passed if you inflated it. It would make bubbles. So he said, no, it's not possible. For sure, it's okay. Maybe the guy was a little bit in a hurry. So he says, why is your guy a little bit in a hurry? Are you paying him to be a mashgiach, or are you paying him to be in a hurry? So I went back and forth, and the guy told me, since then, I don't trust this big mashgiach. So you have a problem. In effect, this probably would have been a torefa that has a stamp from a kashrut organization, not necessarily proof of the fact that it's kosher or not, just that it received the approval of someone who had a stamp in his hand, and whether or not he looked at it or checked it is something else, but we have to assume they do their job competently the majority of the time, and that's what everybody's relying on. But at the end of the day, you're still relying on one person. You're relying on the guy with the stamp, you're relying on the guy with the knife, you're relying on the guy. So Rashi says like this. The reality is that it's almost as if the Gemara itself didn't tell us this, didn't teach us this. We hold this way anyway. In other words, we trust each other, we assume each other to be telling the truth, and we assume each other to be halachically competent and responsible. And by the way, he gives another example. Let's just Turma Maaseh. I have a field. In my backyard, I happen to grow wheat. Well, thank God, I've been through Parashat Shabbat a few times. I know that wheat is biblically required to have Maaser taken from it. I take out 10% for the Lewi, another 10% of that goes to the Kohen. A few other issues, it ends up being 11% and change. So, if you come to eat in my house, you're going to have to trust that I took out the maaser. What if we weren't there when I did it? How do you know it was done? Because I have a beard? Like a glue on it. Or do you not eat by him because he doesn't have a beard? No. The point that Rashi is making is that this concept is fundamental to the Jewish faith, fundamental to Halakhah. We trust each other. The question is only when do we not trust each other? The Tosafot make this point, and they say, it's very interesting what Rashi points out, save for the fact that if you know that someone's halachically incompetent, there's no mitzvah to eat from his food. It's a concept that my wife and I use a lot when it comes to kashrut. There are things that are kosher, there are things that aren't. There are things that might be kosher, but there's no mitzvah to eat it. It's like airline fish. No, airplanes, I was thinking. But yeah, technically be kosher, just if you really want to be sick, you could eat it. So the point they're making is that, just because I don't want to offend or insult someone doesn't mean that I should rely on unreliable kashrut, or I should trust someone who has no halachic competence whatsoever. And then it becomes a question of what are the requirements or the responsibilities of the individual in question. Well, to go back to what we were talking about a Beit HaMikdash, I have to assume the Kohen Gadol knows what he's doing, although there were very long periods of our history, perhaps the majority of the period of Beit HaMikdash, certainly the second one, where the Kohanim were corrupt. They would buy the office, they would buy the rights to the kahuna. The big kahuna, that's an expression in English? You've heard this before? The big kahuna, that's it. The kahuna gola, it's like the position of prominence. Because they don't even know what they're saying. So, but yes, it was for sale during much of the second Beit HaMikdash. So, you have a Kohen, you have to trust him. If the Kohen is someone trustworthy and knowledgeable, hopefully he is, because he was appointed for this job, then you rely upon him. If there's a case of, for example, in the example of shechita, you trust the shochet to eat from it, you don't. If there's a kashrut organization that's known to be responsible and to be careful, then yes, you're going to rely on them, or at least on the person they send out over there. At the end of the day, you're still relying on one person to tell you it's kosher or it's not. So, as a principle, Rashi would like to prove this from the fact that people eat at each other's houses. And we've never seen anyone complain or say there's something wrong with it. Tosafot point out, well, mistakes do happen. You do have to be careful. The Gemara tells a story of a woman who brought home meat and served it to her guests, and later found out there's miscommunication between her and her husband. Imagine that, it was like the first time in history. Miscommunication between husband and wife, where she thought he removed the chalev, and he thought she was going to do it. She realized what had happened, and she jumped off the roof and committed suicide. Like, I can't believe I just had guests in my house who had something not kosher, because I didn't do what I was supposed to do. In other words, people took it seriously. So in a situation like that, where people are so sensitive to it, they say, hey, this is my reputation on the line. I'd be humiliated in front of the whole community if I were to do something halakhically irresponsible that you can rely on. What happens if you're in the house of a not so religious relative or a not so religious friend? How do you negotiate and navigate situations in which the person in question is not exactly halakhically competent? It becomes a little bit more complicated. I'm not going to answer the questions now. We'll talk about that next week. How do you trust the untrustworthy when it comes to Kashrut? A couple of quick points on one foot. We'll take this up more at length next week. Number one, just because someone's not observant doesn't mean they don't necessarily care about Kashrut, right? AKA the life and times of the traditional Jew. There are mitzvot that I keep, there are mitzvot that I don't keep. And I care about some of them, I don't care about others. Some of them make me happy, some of them make me sad. So I decide kind of arbitrarily which mitzvot I'm going to keep and which ones I don't. What is my halachic status? I might call myself traditional on dating websites, but what's my official halachic status? Am I reliable? Am I unreliable? Am I a heretic? Am I a part-time heretic? Am I like a mercenary heretic? Like only under certain terms and conditions will I keep the mitzvot or not keep the mitzvot? So it's often going to depend on which mitzvot the person observes. Not just a question of you have to be perfect, because I hate to break your heart. The reality is that if you have someone has to be perfect in order to be halakhically trustworthy, how many of us are perfect? I recuse myself from the discussion. We'll end up with, okay, too, thank you. I felt bad, I was alone.
What I want to mention is there are people, even that I personally met in Israel and here, they may be lenient in certain commandments, but they are, they're extremely stringent when it comes to other commandments. There's certain things that even the Chilonim, or the so-called Chilonim, right? They may perform a particular mitzvah much better than the vast majority of the so-called Latini.
Yeah, don't laugh. Rabbi Menachem, let me ask you a question. This concept of observing some mitzvot and not observing other mitzvot, it started in the 1980s or 90s, or it's like 5,000 years ago?
Well, I'm just saying, just to have this be a reality, it's a current, it's unfortunately.
I think it's as current as it was 2,000, 3,000 years ago. If someone needs to be perfect in order to be halachically reliable, I hate to tell you that none of us who are married in this room are actually married, none of us who are divorced are actually divorced, and in fact, I have a question about some of the singles. What does that mean? If the witness has to be perfect under my chuppah, that means I need Mashiach. So weddings won't happen, right? But people want to get married. So because people want to get married, we should use less than perfect witnesses. Well, sometimes that's what you do. What if I have to write a get? I'll give you a funny story, right? Imagine this, like a hypothetical situation. I go to Bergen County Corrections. We have to write a get in a prison. How many kosher witnesses can they're all kosher. They're all.
Did you find one?
No, usually we would bring witnesses to a situation like that. There the question becomes, what happens if the husband himself is a criminal? It's a purely hypothetical question. But if there was a Jewish guy who also committed a crime, what do I do if I need to write a get and I need to rely on his halakhic competency? I ask him questions like, are you giving this get of your own free will and volition? Meaning, am I forcing you to give this get? Is the officer with the gun and the baton forcing you to give it? I'm just the scribe. I'd be happy to help you. He's going to tell me, yes, I'm giving the get voluntarily. Maybe he's lying. Maybe he's doing this in order to get out of prison or in order to get out of a fine or a penalty that's written into his divorce agreement. So we very often have to rely on people who aren't perfect. That's okay. Don't have a heart attack, okay? But the gitin are kosher, the weddings are kosher. The food is kosher, even if people who are not perfectly kosher are behind them. The question is going to be, what are their individual defects? And so often you'll hear things at a wedding like, look, the chatan and the kala very often have relatives and friends they want to honor with things. And for the rabbi, we get it's like an ulcer that starts when they want to use someone as a witness who's not really observant. So usually we'll say, listen, you want to give out Sheva brachot, you want to do whatever. The witnesses, just, if you don't mind, let's try, here are the basics. Someone who is Sabbath observant and who eats kosher food. Doesn't put on tefillin d'Rabbeinu Tam, I'll let that one slide. Not perfectly careful about certain things. We'll have to just don't ask, don't tell kind of policy making. What I want to know is like the big general kind of believes in God, believes in Shabbat, and eats kosher food. Those are relatively easy benchmarks. That's not setting the bar very high. That sounds like Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach. Like, doesn't kill, doesn't steal, doesn't adulter, and doesn't worship idolatry. But, we try to keep the expectations reasonable, feasible, basic, and somehow pertinent and relevant to the matter at hand. We'll talk about that more next week. What does Sabbath observance have to do with weddings and divorces? What does eating kosher have to do with your ability to sign a get? We'll analyze that a little bit more closely and then kind of compare and contrast to this actual current reality of not too many people being perfect and the world continuing to function, the halachic world continuing to function nonetheless.
That's why the word sibur, keep rolling over. It's a tzaddikim benoni b'rishayim.
That's the Maharani Prague, yes.
Right. So
The word tzibur, right? Tzaddik, benoni, v'rasha.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
Congregations of people generally are composed of individuals who are righteous, individuals who are in the middle, individuals who aren't, in varying demographic reflection. Yeah. Here's what it is. Until the world's perfect, we'll keep working on ourselves. Shalom Kochem. See you guys next week.